Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to this Audit Standards and Risk Committee meeting. I don't think we need introductions. We have two substitute members, but I'm sure you're all familiar with who they are. Councillors Healy and oh, sorry, there you go. Michael, I do apologise, I was looking for you there. Okay, welcome. I know Councillor Healy has been to previous meetings anyway. Right, so the first item is welcome, which we've done, and apologies. Are there any apologies?
The only other apology we have is from Hassan, and item 10 will be covered by his colleague McKees.
Thank you very much. Any urgent announcements? Nope. Items to be considered in the absence of the public and press? Yes, there are some.
Yeah, we have two that will be considered without the public and press, so the webcast will be paused. That's item 16, internal audit reports, and item 17, replacement CRM system update.
Thank you very much. We'll pause at that stage. Reports from questions by, declarations of interest. Any pecuniary or non-pecuniary interest to be declared? Nope. Reports from questions by members, not indicated. Questions from members of the public? Nope. For those who might be watching, welcome. Minutes and action of the previous meeting held on the 17th of July. Can we confirm that they're a correct record? And are there any questions or matters arising from them? No? Okay. Straight into health and safety update, the exciting bit. Sean Rogers.
I'm afraid you've got me today.
Okay, well I'll set you. Welcome.
Thank you. So obviously you've all read the report, and I will take it that has been read. There are a few additional items just to add on, or a few updates to add on, which I'll give you now. So number one this week is Fire Door Safety Week, so I hope you're all paying attention, closing those doors. In addition to that, can't read my paper, the SIFTL 2 comments with regarding the riddles, just to bring you up to date. With the trams going to Nunnery Depot, etc., there is an agreement in place with the ambulance service. So it's just to confirm that is an agreement, and there is a process that is followed. The other, which was the derailment, it was a minor derailment, and it was actually a driver under instruction, and it was due to the low speed and climb out thereof, and that has now been put into lessons learned and is now within their future training programme. So that has been actioned. Also, just to let you know, a head of SHEC for SIFTL has been appointed and is due to commence in December of this year. And finally, with regards to health and safety, we are currently reviewing Martin's Law, and we are looking at the potential of there being a standard duty with regards to interchanges, but that is only a possibility, and I will update you further obviously at the next meeting. A security paper has been drafted already.
So they're the 3 interchanges where there are the most incidents?
Yes, it's generally places that can be general public can access, and it's the number of people which would relate to us.
Okay.
So they're all currently being reviewed, but as I say, I will bring an update on that to the next meeting for each interchange.
And just for my sake, explain a little bit about what you mean by climb out.
Oh, that now you're asking a bit technical question there with the tram for me. But it's, hang on, they did give me a bit of a technical. So it was derailment of second bogie caused by low speed climb out, exacerbated by stop start low speed driving of the driver.
I think, Chair,
Yes.
wheel.
I'm glad somebody can help me with that.
Thank you. It's the climb out of the machine rather than passengers. So, yes. Okay. Well, thank you very much for clarifying that, because I think some people, not me of course, but some people watching might not have understood that. Thank you. Any questions on that? Yes.
Just a point of clarification. School by area, apologies for that. On the SIFTL report, I think if I remember it correctly, they talked about the issue was about passengers being taken into the depot. So from what I understood from what you said is we've got an agreement with the ambulance service that if we're going to detrain ill passengers, it will be at Nunnery depot and not on the network. Is that right?
They will either go to the nearest terminus or the depot, depending on distance.
Okay, thank you. And then the issue about, so have we now said that we're not going to take passengers into the depot, we're going to put the passengers off the tram, or will they still go in with the injured casualty?
Yeah.
So I think the process, as I understand it, Paul, is that the non-injured passengers are detrained before the tram is then returned to the depot with the injured person on board to then meet with the ambulance service at the depot. So it's only the injured individual that's taken back to the depot for that purpose.
That's fine, thank you very much for clarifying that. And then I just had one other question on the numbers, please. On Appendix 1 and Appendix 2 to the safety report, are those the same, is that the same data represented in a different way? Because number 1 is antisocial behaviour, health and safety, crime, all incidents that we've had at an interchange. And then I think Appendix 2 gives us a greater analysis of antisocial behaviour.
Yes, that's correct.
And crime. Because I couldn't get the two to add up to equal one another. I'm not going to bore the meeting with it now, but there seemed to be, if you looked at Appendix 1 for other members, there's 224 incidents, less health and safety, less the antisocial behaviour, leaves you with 47 crimes to come back to 224. And when you look at Appendix 2, everything to the right of the ASB column, fifth one in, I got that to add up to 57. And I just question the integrity of the data, because when I started to look at individual incidents at a location, the two didn't tally between Appendix 1 and Appendix 2. I'm quite happy to stay behind after the meeting and share what work I've done with you and talk you through it, because it could be classification in my understanding, but it wasn't obvious when I looked.
No, more than happy to talk about it after the meeting, and you know, if there is an error, then I'd quite like to see it.
Yeah, thank you, because I appreciate there's an awful lot of work goes into producing this, and it's good information. And I just wondered, Chair, when Internal Audit are doing their normal work, because I understand we've got the workload plan for this year, is there any opportunity to test how management make use of data that's provided within the authority? Because if there is an error, and this has not been picked up by us before, then perhaps we should consider how information is presented, because it doesn't immediately jump out.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful if we could just spend a little bit of time with the team just to analyse what we're looking at here, and then if we come back at the next session with a review of where we've got to on that, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you'll engage that process.
I'll sort that out with
Okay,
Claire
thank
and
you.
the team. Thank you, Jeff.
Just a couple from me. The low-speed derailment, I think I ended up being, it felt like a bit of a near miss, but I think I was then, your comments today sort of satisfied me that we'd done the learning necessary from that, because, you know, next time it could be worse if it was on a corner. But I think what you're telling us is that you've already done lessons learned from that, and you're happy that, yeah, okay. And the other one was just paragraph 2.4 in the main report, which is the fire risk assessments. It says, of the actions identified, the majority have had either action raised or been closed off, which is, for me, just a tiny bit vague. In that, I think I'd like to know, I'd like to have some numbers on that. How not now. I'm not asking you off the top of your head to give me the numbers on it, but for future reports, I'd like to know how many we've got, how many have been closed, how many, if any, and hopefully none are overdue. I just think, nowadays in fire, I think we all feel quite sensitive on it, and that didn't give me quite enough assurance that we were absolutely on top of that issue. So could we just expand that paragraph and be a bit more specific about how many we've got? And
Yeah, absolutely. We can certainly give you specifics, and we can do it via each location, so you can be very clear on what's happening.
Oh, yeah, or even just in almost in total, and then if necessary, drill down. Well, drill down if there's loads and loads and loads of them that aren't done, but not if we're pretty much saying the only ones left are 3 low risk ones out of the 35 that have been raised. We've only got a tiny number. So yeah, thank you.
No problem.
Sorry, Joe, just one other compliment, if I may, because this committee's discussed health and safety training before. It's good to see that there's been such a good response this time, up to 91%. That's really well done to everybody, I think.
Anything further? Nope. And so we're going to Supertram Health and Safety.
I think that's over to me. Good morning, everyone.
That's right.
My name's Will Dunnett, and I'm currently the interim managing director of Supertram. You can see within the report that we've sent you, and it's the report entitled Supertram Health and Safety Progress Update. The ask was to give you assurance in terms of how we've managed safety over the first 6 months of the operation. And I think the report I'll take as read, but just picking out the core highlights about where change has happened within the business. Ordinarily, during a transfer of this nature, you do as little change as possible, and that would be a stipulation from the ORR. But under their guidance and under their working with them, we've made really kind of 5 core changes within the business of that first 6 months. I think the first of which is leadership, second of which is governance, organisational design and training. The third is the way that we've engaged and learned from stakeholders. The fourth being the way that we've developed some transparent reporting in our planning, which is through the 100-day and full year plan. And the final area is that continuous improvement as we undergo a cultural change for the business that makes sure safety is the top of everyone's agenda. So really, they're the core elements that we've done over the last 6 months. And I think within the way that we report, we're able to prove that a lot of that work has borne fruit. So most of the incidents that we have are understood. We've just talked about a climb out and got into detail around that, and we understand the reasons behind it. We can make learning and move forward. So really, I think for the purposes of today, it's really those 5 elements I want to re-emphasise and really hand it over if there's any questions from colleagues.
Any questions, comments? Yes.
Again, just a comment on page 43. There are a couple of tables at the bottom.
Yeah.
Being really lazy almost. The cumulative to date column would be improved with a red, amber, green, I think, on it, just so we know whether it's a. There are some, you know, slips, trips and falls, non-movement, for example, is annual target's less than 6 and we're at 32 already. So we could probably, perhaps we'll ask a question, why have we got so many non-movement slips, trips and falls this year? A lot of the others, on the other hand, are looking like they're going fairly well for the year. So movement, slips, trips and falls are 35 for nearly half year against a target of less than 106. But just being, it would be slightly easy to see what we should be pulling out if that was just graded in the future. And again, so question on non-movement, and the other one was hazard reported brackets Bosria. Is it me? Should I know what Bosria is? I was tempted to say and Herzegovina, but clearly not. It's clearly not that. What's Bosria?
So it's an internal measure, which is a code for big or small, report it all. But again, it's just a way of bringing to life, having colleagues report back to us. You know, really good mechanism for colleagues on the front face to report hazards and things that they see as maybe not in line. It is worth saying, just as well, picking up your first question, in terms of the numbers, we have made a real push into this business, and part of the due diligence for colleagues to report all incidents, all near misses. We felt that, and from talking to colleagues, what was clear is reporting wasn't happened because there was a perception that nothing happened to those reports. So that is generally why we've seen a spike on some of the incidents. And we use a daily call routine now to make sure that each and every incident is reviewed and moved forward and potentially escalated to the leadership meeting that you can see documented in there, or indeed the safety board, which I take as being the safety team's opportunity to hold me to account. So hopefully that explains those two areas.
Okay, thank you. Could you just have a star and underneath the table have the Bosria explained for me, because I won't remember it by the next meeting, and anyone who's
that's fine.
viewing for the public. And sorry, so you're saying that the slips, trips and falls are it's just much better reporting now. So we need an annual target that's more realistic than less than 6.
Absolutely. And again, in terms of setting some of these targets, some of these measures weren't measured previously. So almost we were trying to take an estimate based on a business that we'd not necessarily been running in the last year. I think it is worth saying on those slips, trips and falls, I think if you add them together, we're on target. And perhaps it's just the way that we've skewed them between movement and non-movement incidents.
Okay, thank you. And I said the final bit was just if you can do green, amber, red on the final column, that'd be great.
Understood.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Paul.
Thank you, Chair. So just while we're on slips, trips and falls, just clarifying, would that include somebody, a passenger on a tram falling over whilst the tram's moving? Is that the difference between movement and non-movement?
That's exactly right, Paul.
Thank you. And then the only other comment and observation I was going to make was, I think it's good what the new team is doing, because changing the culture of the organisation is the key thing to getting safety right. So much empirical research shows that it's about the culture of the organisation and human behaviour that's behind so many accidents. And that point about don't bother reporting it because nobody does anything about it is the first thing you've got to get over if you're going to get engagement from staff and get people to take things seriously. And I think in terms of the numbers, for me, the graph at the top of page 43 showing the number of signals passed at stop has come down very dramatically from where we were before. I think it's well below what they achieve on the national. So in terms of when I say well below, not as good as what they achieve on the national network for the number of services that run. But I think that scale of improvement is to be commended and looks good for the future.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that whole point that you make on safety leadership is exactly the direction of travel that we're on.
Can I just ask about staff assaults?
Yeah.
28 cumulative to date. We've seen in the press reports of body cam usage. Has that brought them down?
So I think the assaults is definitely an area where they were being reported by colleagues. So we've really taken a real focus on understanding where assaults are taking place and mapping them across our network, understanding where we've got areas of trend that we want to work with. We've done a lot of work with colleagues, which includes body cam usage, better harnesses so the video footage is better signage, putting cultural posters out there that are explaining that our colleagues are human beings, mums, dads, grandfathers, and also conflict avoidance training as well, so that if people are in a conflict situation, they can manage that better and make themselves out of harm's way. It is a trend that doesn't seem to be going away in terms of the incidents that we have on trams, but I think we do at least know where those are and are managing them accordingly, making sure that we give the right duty of care to colleagues, and also working and looking to work with other transport providers as well that are seeing the same trend. So it's not just restricted to tram. We're seeing that across the network and across some of our kind of core travel areas. There's a lot to do in this area, and we'll continue to do it by engaging with our colleagues and just making sure they feel safe to come to work.
So just developing your comment about staff assaults, Chair, and going back to what we talked about, the data in the previous item. With the analysis that we do, can we identify that to times of day to see whether or not it's late night services that are particularly, where staff are particularly vulnerable?
Yeah, so it's generally city centre services. When we've had the rail replacement works, Paul, we've not seen half as many incidents. So it isn't necessarily restricted to evening or daytime, but it's definitely, in and around the city centre.
Right, thank you.
Yes, Steve.
Thanks. I find the targets that are set in the lag safety KPIs dangerous, because when we've set targets so low for some things, it may well stop people reporting them. Coming from a health background, I prefer to see reporting done, whether it is inside or outside the target. So I'd like some sort of assurance that people don't stop reporting that when the target's being met. I mean, it's a strange way of looking at how we report things, setting targets for incidents.
So I think the culture that we develop within this business is absolutely the opposite. We want people to report what is happening out there. I issue a Friday feedback, which is an all bulletins communication, and every Friday I'm asking again, if there's incidents, if there's occurrences out there, we really do want to know them. And I can absolutely see as we review those on a daily basis that people are doing that. So I haven't got my eye on the annual target. I've got my eye on actually, in individual incidents and what do we need to improve and where do we need to drive better. But be mindful of that comment and where we can give the committee assurance.
Yeah, and presumably people who will be reporting wouldn't be aware of the less than 38.
No, not at all.
6, etc. They will be influenced more by the Bosria factor, would they?
Yes, certainly, and but from a leader's point of view, and as being the managing director of the business, I see every small incident as being a potential escalation. So while it might be a verbal assault now, we've seen in other transport networks that can quite easily become a physical assault. So the early reporting of incidents does allow us and give us data in order to provide mitigation and support to colleagues.
Content, Steve. Paul.
Just one other, please. Picking up the comments that Steve and David made, do we have any comparative data we could put in there from other tram network operators like Metrolink or Net in Nottingham, please?
We could. We're a very, very different network, but certainly we do use some of the stakeholder engagement, particularly through LRSB, to understand where how we stand against other operators. But given that we go through a city centre more than any others, there is a real skew within our data. So I think sometimes normalising that is a little bit more difficult. But I take the point, Paul, and perhaps offline I can work that back to you in terms of what we have got.
I mean, I can take that we're different to Blackpool, but Manchester, Nottingham, they go through city centres, don't they? I just wondered if they might be useful comparators of that, but as long as the information's there. And also just picking up the point about, do we feed back to staff as well how we're doing on safety? Because there are some train operators who make a big thing about we've had 1,000 days since lost time accident or whatever, and show to people that the safety's improving due to the work that we've done.
We do, in terms of the business plan that we've been delivering and the investment we're making in them, and particularly around the assault work. We've trained every single one of our conductors in terms of conflict avoidance. So within that, we've been able to share with them the direction of travel of the business on a much more one-to-one basis. Each of the DMs, our duty managers, review with individuals every time there's been an incident. So that duty of care is incredibly strong now. And indeed, as I said, I mentioned that Friday feedback has been an opportunity to just share with the colleagues more widely where we've got success and to be fair, areas where we need to improve more as well.
Thank you.
Any further questions? No. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for your report.
Thank you for your time.
And we go on to update, item 10, update on the external audit and accounts.
That would be me. Hi everyone. So with respect to 22-23, EY has presented the interim value for money audit report. In the appendix, you can find that for South Yorkshire Passenger Transport Executive. I was informed in the morning that the pack does not contain South Yorkshire Mayoral Combined Authority, but it's a pretty similar report. Overall, if we talk about it, it's a positive report. We are required under NAO's 2020 Code of Audit Practice to provide reporting and commentary in terms of the arrangements for the value for money by the entity. The reporting criteria comprises of three main stuff, including the financial sustainability, the governance, and the improving of economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. We did have some of the risk identifications in terms of significant weaknesses, but overall, no significant weakness was identified either for South Yorkshire Passenger Transport Executive or for the Mayoral Combined Authority. If we do identify any weakness, we are required to report by exception, which was not the case for both of the entities. If you need any further information, happy to answer any questions in this respect.
Thanks for that. Just sort of one from me. On page 61, you discuss the levels of revenue and capital reserves, which are given as 100 million and 71 million respectively. So anybody reading this, member of public reading this, that's going to sound like a lot of money. So I was going to say, could we give a more nuanced position, i.e. the free reserves in this? I've got a horrible feeling you're going to tell me this report has been finalised and it's too late to do that. In which case it'll be a comment to next year's auditors. When doing that, can you give the sort of free reserve position rather than the total? Because 170 million is going to sound like a lot. to you, if you do have an opportunity to change it, well, it's gone public now, so I'm guessing there's no opportunity to give that more nuanced figure before we go ahead. So I'll look for a nod from you to say you can't change it, and then a nod from the new external auditor to say they'll consider it for next year.
Yeah, that sounds fine. Because these are 22-23 numbers, so yes, the 23-24 numbers would be way more updated than this one. I agree. And also, just to note that these are the group figures, so including both of the entities in the group as well.
Okay, two nods seem to do it. Any further questions or comments? No. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and moving on to updated indicative external audit plan.
Thank you. So this is an update to the audit plan that we presented to you at the last audit committee on the 17th of July. So we've outlined on page 3 of our audit plan, or 73 of the pack, any key changes that we've made to that plan for kind of the ease of review of committee members. So we have updated our materiality levels based on actual reported year-end figures, as opposed to our previous audit plan being based on forecast total expenditure as at Q2. So as a result of that, our materiality balance has reduced from 9 million to 7.5 million, and we'll now be reporting any misstatements over £375,000 to the audit committee, as opposed to 450,000 previously. We've also updated our significant risks in relation to the valuation of land and buildings. So with the reclassification of infrastructure assets this year that was presented at the previous audit committee, it's now there's now only 3 assets that are subject to annual revaluation as part of the year-end process. So we have reduced our risk in relation to that and have downgraded it from a significant risk, given the limited estimation uncertainty in relation to that balance, given the volume and value of transactions included in that now. And as a result of that, we were initially intended to use our valuation specialists to audit the valuation of land and buildings. But again, given the reduction of that significant risk, we will be doing that as a core audit team now. The only other change to the plan compared to the plan presented in July is it now includes our value for money risk assessment for 23-24. So as you can see on page 18 of the plan, or 88 of the pack, we haven't identified any significant risks in relation to any of the 3 domains of value for money. And our commentary is included on the following pages, from pages 19 through to 28. So happy to take that as read, but our commentary has been through management to confirm that it is an accurate representation of the authority's arrangements, but happy to take any questions on that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Molly, and for the report. Several for me, none particularly earth-shattering, I don't think. First one, page 73, you talk about materiality. One question, how do the materialities levels compare to last year would be useful piece of information, so we can just tell whether we're getting a similar level of assurance or not. Also, the planned materiality, the planned expenditure on which materiality was based is 356 million. The actual is 294, which is nearly a 20% reduction. Just the usual auditor's question, why has it gone down so much? And while you're pondering on those two, a fairly obvious one, you've now reclassified bus shelters, etc., as infrastructure assets. I take it you're happy with that change in treatment. Good if you could confirm that. And a final one for you or for Gareth. Page 95 talks about us not having a finance committee, which I suppose begs a question about whether, as we get bigger, that's something we need to consider at some point or not? So 4 questions there from.
Thanks. So in terms of the materiality figures, so from a comparison year on year, what you'll see is obviously the previous auditors will have set their materiality within their 22-23 external audit plan. Obviously that's available online. From our perspective, I think our overall materiality figure is probably slightly higher. Obviously within audit and standards, we're required to set a materiality within 0.5 to 3% of a total expenditure benchmark. So we are within the relevant benchmark. What you will see within the performance materiality is we're allowed to set that at 3 different levels based on the risk we perceive to be within the organisation. So those levels within KPMG and KPMG guidance are 85%, 75% and 65%. Our total set at 65%, so one of the lowest, and that's basically to take account of the risk associated with the first year audit, whereby the prior year numbers have been unaudited. So our benchmarks, our materiality benchmark and percentage is lower than it could be at the top end. Our performance materiality is lower than we might see going forward once we gain more assurance about the internal controls framework and the prior year numbers as we move forward as part of our audit. In terms of the benchmark itself, as Molly says, when we were setting our original materiality benchmark, it was based on forecast figures that were publicly available within the reports. Obviously, when we get to the end of the year and we see the draft financial statements, we have to look at the actual benchmark from that point of view. So as part of the work that we're doing is we do plan and analytics and final analytics to understand those key movements between the forecast, budget and actual. That work's still ongoing. I'm sure that Gareth or Mike or Owen would probably have that information more readily at hand as our work's ongoing, but rest assured it is a key part of our work to understand that drop in that value. In terms of the point on the finance committee, I would say that probably what we see across sectors and across organisations is we would tend to see a finance committee in place. Obviously, it's up for the organisation, so it would be considered to be best practice, but obviously, we haven't found any arrangements in place that would suggest that a lack of a finance committee in the current state of the MCA has stopped the organisation from securing value for money and its arrangements. But as you said, going forward, it may be food for thought in terms of whether one should be introduced into the governance arrangements. And forgive me if I've missed the 4th question. But
well, that's always a trouble when someone asks several questions. It's very hard to keep them.
I'm racking my brain.
The 4th question was, I think you can do with a yes or no.
Oh, the infrastructure assets. Yeah.
Infrastructure assets.
So we've taken it through our technical and risk team, who are happy with conceptually with the movement that's happened of the assets to infrastructure assets. We have had conversations with management around the fact that it represents a change in accounting policy, which normally speaking would need to be applied retrospectively and therefore change the prior year numbers. However, once again, we've considered the materiality of that in terms of, I suppose, based on the fact that the prior year numbers will remain unaudited, I suppose, would it affect the users of the accounts determinations and decision making? And once again, we've been through our technical and risk team and are happy that with enhanced disclosure around this change in accounting policy in terms of the detail and what's led to the change, that we're happy that the users of the accounts will be fully informed and aware of the change and the changes that it's made to the financial statements.
Okay, thank you. So I don't want to do a long explanation on this, but just the change in spend from plan just seems quite a lot. Is there a very short reason for that, or shall I leave it to after the meeting?
I think it largely relates to slippage on the capital programme. So we have an ongoing issue regarding the quality of financial forecasting that is coming out of partner project teams that I think this committee has talked about before. Its delivery is now much better across the authority following a series of system level changes that we made to how we deliver the capital programme. We still have an issue though about the the numbers that are coming back from delivery teams, what we've done to address this year is apply optimism bias throughout our budgeting and financial reporting. So we've taken the numbers that are prepared for us by local authority teams and then used historical data to then apply an OB figure, and I think that was around 30% at the start of the financial year, and we're just reviewing what the appropriate number would be for our mid-year reset that we'll undertake, and what we are undertaking right now.
Thank you.
So just a question on that slippage. What is the level of slippage, say, from last quarterly forecast to year end, roughly?
I honestly can't remember. I'm just looking to Owen and Simon, see if you can recall.
Yes, I can. So the Rev 3 forecast was 173.6 million, and we outturned at 150 million. So there's a slippage of 23 million from Rev 3 to outturn on the capital programme.
So that's about, what, 12.5%, something like that, which isn't bad compared to other places I've been, but I take your point about it's not close enough as it should be when you're at that late stage, because all your contracts are out and you know what's going to be delivered.
Yes, some of the numbers involved were reasonably chunky. So we had a hanging transaction that would have been for a bullet payment of £7 million for a loan that was due to be advanced to a business, subject to satisfactory discharge of conditions of the award. That didn't quite happen. So 7 of the 12 was just a genuine issue that could have fallen either side of the line. But we do overall still have a problem with the quality of the reporting.
Thank you, Chair. Just on page 98, please, of our pack, 28 of the audit pack. We say there the authority does not currently outsource any significant services. What do you set as the criteria for significant in this respect?
I suppose from our point of view, it's core business processes. Right. So it could be payroll, for instance. It could be I work with organisations whereby the whole finance function is outsourced to a third party from that point of view. So we understand obviously that to a certain extent some of the Treasury services sit with Sheffield Council, but doesn't represent a true service organisation from our definition. So I suppose it's anything that we would normally expect to see within an organisation that's been fundamentally lifted and moved outside.
Right, so you're not looking at the value of outsourced services, because I think all the infrastructure or the infrastructure maintenance, certainly for the tram and just for things like bus shelters, that's outsourced, isn't it, to Bidvest Noonan?
Tram cleaning, bus stop shelter interchange cleaning is managed through a contract, with a third party.
Okay, thank you.
Oh.
So I'll turn you on. Right.
Thank you. Okay, perfect. Yes, so this is a paper just updating the committee. It comes following 2 audits of adult education budget, which were focused primarily on the organisation's setup and how we deliver adult education rather than the performance of the programme in of itself. So the paper provides an update on the processes we follow to performance manage, gives some details of the actions we've taken and the things we've implemented, as well as a snapshot of performance throughout the last academic year. Just some points it's worth mentioning. Adult Education Budget is the former name for what is now called Adult Skills Fund. It is devolved budget of £40 million that came to us in academic year 21-22, which started August of 2021. We have delivered since then approximately £40 million a year worth of adult skills funding, revenue funding to fund training and learning, both through grant to colleges, local authorities, and procured provision. And within our performance process, we also manage free courses for jobs, which is a separate £3 million per annum delegated, not devolved fund, but we have a single set of performance management processes that we follow across both funding streams. I'll pause and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Chair. Just a point of clarification then from me. Could you say that we're looking at performance in terms of how much we've spent against the budget? I was interested that you say this paper doesn't deal with, as it were, the outcomes, what we get for that. Are those outcomes measured, and are those available to the authority to see what we're achieving with this?
Yes, so some outcomes are and some are not, and we're in the process of developing an outcomes framework as it stands. What we do have is for a portion of the funding detail on both learner enrolments, achievements, and then destinations. So an enrolment being a start of a course, an achievement being successful completion, and a destination being moving on to further learning, into work, etc. A portion of the funding does not habitually report that on a learner-by-learner basis, and so we are in the process of developing and piloting during this year a outcomes framework to capture that information more clearly across the whole gambit of adult skills funding.
Thank you. That's encouraging that we can see if we're using our money effectively. And are we at risk if, say, someone is enrolled on a course and doesn't complete it? Do we lose the funding for that, or is that not a risk we're dealing with?
May I? So if a learner enrolls, we would only pay a portion of the funding because there is generally a portion attributed to completion of the course as well. So there is a financial incentive for all learning organisations to see learners through. In terms of loss of funding to us as an MCA, not for Adult Skills Fund because it is devolved funding. Were there to be a pattern of this being a regular occurrence, I expect there would be questions asked from the Department for Education, but there is not a clawback regime as such in terms of if a learner does not achieve, the funding is removed from us.
And just roughly, what level of, what percentage of students complete the entire course and see it through, please?
As I pause for breath, I will tell you. And again, it's a difficult thing to make a sweeping generalisation on because there are lots of different types of courses, but if we look at accredited learning specifically, I will give you the standing current rate for completions across. So our pass rate stands at about 85%.
Thank you. I think in this area, I know it's been an area we've looked at in the past. I take quite a lot of comment from quite a lot of comfort, from the comments later in the report and from an internal report we've got on it. So overall, I think it's not an area I'm concerned in. But I was just trying to understand the graph at 2.4. One obvious performance to R10. R10's period 10, is it out of 12? Yeah,
yes.
The R fooled me for what it meant. And then I think following on from Paul's point, are we trying to get financial performance to 100%, or are we saying because people will drop out of courses it'll never be 100% and there's a target level we're trying to get to? Because some of those levels are still quite significantly below 100%, so still indicate a bit of a problem. But if it's a case that you can never get to 100% because everyone has to finish the course, and not everyone's ever going to finish a course and the target's lower, it'd almost just be a bit helpful to have that tweak to a sort of, to have a line that we'd expect it to get to. At the moment it's data, but it's not telling me the information of whether I need to worry on it or not. As I said, later stuff tells me I don't need to worry on it, but
fair point to add a sort of target position, which I would say would be 97% is sort of the industry standard that's used by Department for Education in terms of allowing for that natural drop-off rate. And so what it's showing is we are closer across our Adult Skills Fund / AEB provision as opposed to our free courses where that gap is more significant.
But still probably not quite there yet, so there's a bit more to do.
Agree.
Well, thank you, Chair. Just a question on the table, so the graph 2.5. There's 12,000 that's not applicable, which just seems quite a lot in that not applicable category. I just wondered if you could explain why we've got so much in that.
So the individual numbers of the different subjects are what are called defined sector subject areas, which is the industry standard methodology we use. A large volume of provision is delivered under something called tailored learning, or formerly community learning, that does not necessarily carry with it its own sector subject area in the same way. There is, for this academic year we've just entered, the introduction of a equivalency, because the type of learning is less around the subject which it is delivering and more about the outcome it is driving towards achieving, so that there is a portion of this that is always not sector subject specific and more outcome related, and a future iteration of this report should be able to show you which of those 6 high level outcomes that learning was tailored towards.
Just to round off a few things on this report, I think we asked Joe to come along and prepare this report and to follow on the internal audit reports. And as we said, we've had a series of these over the last couple of years. And that was really just to reflect that this is a significant devolution responsibility. So we didn't have this before 2020-21, as Joe said. And it was a really significant amount of money. So the majority of our revenue money that this authority spent in the past was on transport. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, almost, we were spending an equivalent amount of money on adult skills. And it probably gets less attention than some of our transport matters because it's simply not as high profile within the public interest. So we've been keen to point internal audit to this in the past, and we're keen for Joe to come along and talk to you today. I think the overall trend is that provision and what we've been able to procure has been improving year on year. We disrupted the market in the first year that we did this. We did that deliberately because we didn't want just more of the same that had been commissioned by the Adult Skills Agency in the past. So we started to do things differently, and that was because the entire point of devolution in this space is that we commission activity that is right for South Yorkshire rather than what was right for someone sat in Whitehall on a national perspective. So there have been some teething problems inevitably, because if you do disrupt the market, you bring new entrants in, it takes people time to get up to speed and to establish their workforce, to establish premises, to get that relationship with learners on an ongoing basis. So the trajectory is that things are definitely improving. The internal audit reports have certainly been helpful to us in making sure that the way that we deliver services is as robust and efficient as possible. And then I think that the final point just to say is that where we do underspend against our targets, what we do is flush that money back into what we call our innovation fund within the adult education budget, or adult skills fund as it's now called. And that's enabled us to do some really exciting things that we just simply would not have been able to do in the past. So we're making really good use of underspend where it does arise, And maybe, Joe, next time we come back, we'll be able to highlight some of the innovative schemes that we've funded in recent years.
You'll have to excuse me because I've not seen this report before, and but having worked at the Training Enterprise Council, actually it was in the last century now. There was a lot of fraud in this particular area, and I just wondered what measures you've got in place to make sure that doesn't happen in this programme.
Yeah, absolutely. We recently, following the first audit of AEB performance, introduced a quality and compliance function as one of the recommendations, whose job it is to do due diligence on providers and also go out and audit them to look at, among other things, fraud. There was a very recent fraud in skills audit, which, fraud in skills review provided by RSM, our internal auditors, I should clarify, which looked at our processes across primarily ASF, but also wider skills, and concluded that we do have positive processes to prevent fraud, and made a handful of recommendations for easily implementable things we will have done by the end of this month, to be on the right side as far as we can in relation to fraud. But we already include it in part of our contracting processes, our quality and compliance processes, market engagement, etc. Welcome.
If I may, again, just to round off, so we have been the victims of fraud in this space that dating back, I think, Joe, to 2021. We had an incident that we reported to the police, and that gave us lots of pause for reflection on how we were delivering services. It came quite early into our adoption of this this devolved activity. So again, the internal audit have been asked to come in and just review this several times over in the recent past. So we recognise fraud as an inherent risk in this area. It's just natural in the sort of space in which we're working. So we're very alive to it, and we'll probably keep this on the cyclical audit plan going forward.
Content? Thank you very much for your report.
Thank you.
And moving on to item 13, I have Simon.
If I could just preface this report before we go on. So the Audit Committee asked for us to bring a separate report back to this session that outlined the differences in the application of minimum revenue provision policies between the MCA and the former Office for Police and Crime Commissioner. So if members will recall, the functions, assets, liabilities and so on of the former OPCC was transferred into the MCA in May of this financial year following the mayoral election. Upon that, we took responsibility for all the cash management, debt management activity of the OPCC. So it's incumbent upon us to undertake quite a bit of due diligence. So we talked to you about this last time round in committee session. We said we'd come back today with a review of the differences in the application of the minimum revenue provision policy. So the report that you've got in front of you deals with this on a hypothetical basis, just talks about how different practices would work in a hypothetical situation. I do need to alert the committee, however, that as part of this due diligence exercise, we have identified what we think is an issue. And we're now working through that issue. I've briefed the chair and vice chair separately on this, and when it's appropriate to do so, I will bring a report back to this committee. So I just want to put a marker down on this for the public record and in the minutes that there is an issue that we're now working through. We've said as much as we can to the chair and vice chair at this point, and we will talk to the committee in more detail. We'll have a session with our external audit colleagues after this meeting as well. But if that's okay, I'll just pass over to Simon to explain the report. Thank you.
Yep, sorry, Gav, I'm going to take the presentation of the report today. So as Gareth mentioned, the report covers the differences in MRP policy between the Police Fund and the MCA General Fund. And the examples and illustrations in the report are purely theoretical, and we've done that deliberately to best illustrate how the slight differences in the application of MRP policy plays out over time. Basically, if we started with the actual figures, you wouldn't be able to compare as readily. So both the MCA and the police fund use the asset life method, and within that there are two options for how to calculate the revenue charge. The MCA uses a straight line method, which is essentially applies equal instalments to repay debt associated with capital expenditure, and the police fund uses the annuity method. And that essentially kind of mirrors the principal repayment that you would incur as part of a loan, similar to a mortgage. So both result in the full repayment of debt that's incurred when incurring capital expenditure, but there is a difference in profile of those payments. And whether that's an advantage or disadvantage really depends on the market conditions as to the prevailing interest rates and the impact on the MCA. And that can be managed through the TM strategy in terms of what borrowing and what investments that you take out. So your point to make, I suppose, as the police budget does include plans to finance capital expenditure via borrowing, any change in MRP policy would impact their budget. So if we were to implement the straight line method onto the police fund, that would bring more front-loaded MRP payments and would have a budget implication for them. So on the basis that actually neither method is a particular advantage over the other, and there'd be a real-world impact for having to change the method for the police, we wouldn't propose changing the policy. But I say other than that, I'm happy to take questions.
If I could just round off Owen's point before we take questions, I think that there's an important point that the guidance issued by the government allows you to pick one of two policies. The really important point is that you apply the policy to the asset life of the asset that you've invested into. So if you bought a vehicle for £10,000, you essentially must provide for that debt over the useful life of the asset, and that vehicle may last 5 years. So under the MCA, we'd apply £2,000 each year over 5 years, and that would provide enough cash to meet any debt financing required associated with that. Under the OPCC principle, you'd see a step up each year over 5 years, and that's more akin to your mortgage, where you pay more interest in the early years of your mortgage and more principal at the back end. Now, both options roughly get you to the same point, and the same point is that if you've applied the policy correctly, you've raised all the cash that you need to meet the debt repayments. It's just about the timing of when principal charges are made. So the point that Owen's report makes is that where this matters is in the prevailing interest rates at the time. So under the MCA's policy, you pay off the principal faster, so you are less exposed to upside risk on interest rates. Conversely, if you follow the OPCC principle, you pay off debt more slowly, and because you do that, you potentially get the downside benefit of a lower interest rate environment. So this is about just managing risk in terms of where you think interest rates will be. I think we're comfortable that the MCA's policy is appropriate for our operating circumstances and our cash flows. I think Owen makes a really good point that because Force have budgeted and the OPCC have budgeted for a certain interest rate profile, it would probably take quite a lot for us to divert from that right now. And that leads to the recommendation within the report just to stick with the principles in the report. It works for both parties.
Just one question, Gareth. What roughly is the scale of the difference we'd be looking at in any year? I mean, trying to interpret the gap, it might be 10 million looking at that, but what's the worst case that we're looking at if we switched OPC to MCA, roughly?
I'm not sure we'd be able to answer that question directly. We could work it out and get back to you if it would be helpful. But it'd be material to the budget.
It will be material.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
I'm sure this is a question we'll come back to at a later stage when we know more about the situation. Okay, I think we can finish at that. Thank you very much. Accept the recommendation. And item 14, internal audit plan progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So yeah, we've got a series of internal audit reports to present to you today. Agenda 14, the first one is the progress report. So this is just to update committee members as to where we are against the 24-25 internal audit plan, but also to highlight any reports that's been finalised since the last committee meeting. The full report, there are 3 reports that we have finalised. They are in the pack as well, so I'll come on to those in a moment. But just with regards to the progress report, just pleasing to confirm that all the dates for the remaining audits are booked in for 24-25. The planning is well underway with those. So from my perspective, we're certainly well on track to complete the plan by the end of the financial year, which will obviously then allow us to present your annual report and annual opinion to the first committee meeting after the financial year as well. There is one proposed change to the plan. That's with regards to the PCC integration. We are planning to actually split that review into 2 different sections. So the first one will be performed in November 2024, and then the final section will be in Q4 as well. The reason for this was largely to allow for the Executive Director for Policing and Reform to be in post. If that doesn't occur, we will still plan on those dates to complete the review and report back to this committee as well, so that we are complete in full as planned overall. Appendix A, which is on page 5 of our paper, just shows you where we are against the plan. It also gives you an indication of when we're delivering the reviews as well. There's nice equal flow, so that we can present to this committee as well. And you'll see the dates as well that we're proposing to present to this committee, so you know and can monitor our performance overall and our progress. But I say at this moment in time, I'm very confident that we'll deliver the plan in full. Appendix B just shows some work that we've produced with regards to the emerging risk radar. So we did a survey of 200 board members, so that's some useful bedtime reading, just highlight some of what the key risks that people are seeing. Largely, as you'd expect, cyber's on there, recruitment, retention and so forth. So some of the main ones that have not really changed much over the last couple of years, and we don't really propose to change as much in the future years as well. Our KPIs, we're certainly well on track with those as well, so that's the turnaround of draft reports, final reports. We're getting those turned around within the target, but also pleasing to note as well, management are turning the draft responses around within their target times as well. So we're allowing all our KPIs to be it, both from our perspective, but also from the officers as well. So I think from my perspective, we're progressing well so far. Are there any specific questions before I move on to the individual reports?
Just one from me. Yes, sorry, it's one from me, and it's almost one for Gareth. You mentioned it that the Executive Director of Policing and Reform hasn't been appointed. Can you give us any more information on what's going to happen on that, Gareth?
Yeah, so we have been out to interview over a couple of rounds, but we're unsuccessful in identifying a candidate. We've gone out with a slightly different tack, and there are final stage interviews planned for next week. So we're confident that we'll be able to get someone potentially not in the same sort of scope that we were initially looking. Any successful candidate will then need to obviously work their notice period. So this is the principal reason why we've asked to split the audit in 2. So we think that there's still quite a lot of value in doing some of the work that we initially set out in the scope, and we can get on with that and do that now. But some of the more embedded activity that we wanted the audit to test on probably needs to wait until that person's in post.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So the next report is on Agenda 15. So that's the Fraud Risk Assessment Skills Audit. That's Annex A. So as been mentioned already, so this review actually largely covered the procedures and processes around the Adult Education Budget, or now known as the Adult Skills Fund. We also looked at boot camp contracts as well that was in place. This was performed by our counter-fraud specialists, as has also been mentioned. Even though there are a lot of fraud in the last century, there's certainly a case this year as well. Obviously, you do get a lot of contractors. Contractors have subcontractors and so forth. We have seen a lot of failures with regards to those subcontractors as well, going bust, etc., which does leave people open and exposed as well, which is one of the main reasons why we performed the review as well. It was an advisory review, so there's no formal opinion, but we did raise a conclusion that we overall, based on the work we performed, there was good processes and procedures in place. That said, we did raise 5 actions overall, or management recommendations. 2 of those were medium, 3 were low. All have been accepted by the management team, and if you look at page 6 or page 150 of the actual papers itself, there is a summary of those actions. So just quickly, the first medium was with regards to the due diligence checks that are performed on learner providers, as you'd expect to see. But what we did notice is obviously this was a specific review of fraud. Those checklists on the due diligence didn't actually include fraud or bribery procedures. So there is a management check in there just to ensure that due diligence processes checklists are updated to ensure that they do include what the provider needs to provide with regards to fraud and bribery procedures going forward. The second one was a medium as well. So the MCA does do market warming sessions with potential providers. Again, what we did notice is that those requirements didn't actually mention fraud prevention. So we've got an action in there that the sessions will be updated to make sure that they do include what the MCA's requirements are from a provider on a fraud and bribery perspective, or anti-fraud and bribery perspective. And then there were 3 lows, again all accepted. Due diligence training should be provided for staff that are involved in the process, so they understand what they need to be doing, the checks that they need to be performing. There are the contracts in place should actually include for subcontractors as well. So if you outsource this to a contractor, they then use a subcontractor. What are the processes and procedures and guidance around that? And then the final low one was where you are using a subcontractor, make sure all the checks and balances are being performed as well. So are their staff got DBS checks? Have you got the appropriate qualifications? Because there's one thing, actually passing this on to a contractor, they pass on to a subcontractor, you're still liable for the actions as well. So I would class them as 5 quick wins overall. This is an area that we cover pretty much across all our education client base, and I would say in comparison, this is a good result. But I will pause and see if there's any specific questions.
Just to say well done, I was going to say on that.
Yeah, thanks for that. Just to pick up earlier on, most of the fraud that I saw was the fact that the learners didn't actually exist, and I can't see anything in this that reviews the actual learners and see that they are live individuals.
That would have been part of the scope. Obviously, we didn't pick any issues. This is reported by exception, so there was no specific areas. But as you're right, there tend to be, as you have ghost employees on payroll, you have ghost students as well. So one of the key processes is to make sure that those are checked. But one of the things as well is, as you talked about the numbers and making sure that 85% gets up to the 95% and so forth, that's the relevant communications and comms and keeping those people warm. If they've got issues because they're not turning up for lessons and so forth, what are you doing about that? Have you got action plans and processes to put in place as well? But yes, that would have been covered.
Just to give Steve some assurance that that was an exact example of where we did encounter a fraud back in 2021. Part of our compliance and quality team's function is when we do step in to just do standard tests is just to actually get in touch with learners on a sample basis. Just to give them a call, chat through, ask them, if they have been enrolled, because we have had instances where people existed, but they weren't actually enrolled on courses, and it came as a shock to them to understand that they were learning Mandarin or something like that. But so that's one of the principal roles of the team, where we do go out and actually do sample checks on that.
So just on that point, are there any databases we can match and check against?
So we do get access to quite a lot of data, and we have a data team that supports the ASF team in managing this. I think part of the problem is that whilst we can match off to ESFA data, all we do is just prove someone exists. The problem, as I've just articulated, is that we've encountered issues where people have been able to get a name, get an address, get an NI number, enroll them onto a course, but those people weren't actually enrolled, and that's where the data will only get you so far down the path, and we have to put a bit of jeopardy in for suppliers by having those stepping rights that give us the ability to get in touch with people and ask them the question directly. So,
thank you. So just one other point. On the report, on the good practice recommendation, I think it's on page 148, it talks about the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act. I just wondered if that might be of benefit to members if we did a bit of training on that. I know we've got Treasury management down on the action log to do a course on that. whether or not a short session on that might be helpful on that one.
Yeah, I think we'd agree. I think we probably sign up to that training session as well. So yeah, it's a new bit of legislation that's coming in. Yeah.
All satisfied? Thank you very much for your report. Excellent.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So the next one is Annex B, which is the IT Asset Management Report, which is the second full report we've performed. This actually was performed by our IT audit specialists. As you'll see, the result overall, this was an opinion, so that was a reasonable assurance, which is a positive opinion. That's the second highest tier that we actually give. That result is on the basis that we did raise 4 low management actions, again, all agreed by the management team. On page 6 or page 164 of the papers is actually a summary of those 4 low priority actions. So just quickly, the first one was with regards to the need for a formal process for chasing assets. So you get a member of the staff that leaves, they've got a laptop, how do you get that laptop back? What are the processes to escalate that if you don't receive it in a timely manner? So it's probably a standard control that we'd expect to see in place. Develop a schedule for hardware asset audits. So what that means is that IT asset audit in the place you expect it to be? Again, a common process. Is everything where it should be? Make sure it's not being lifted and so forth. But that's also important to make sure that you're keeping your asset register up to date as well. The third one was a need to review the standard operating procedures manual. Again, a standard process just to ensure it's fit for purpose, it covers best practice, and then that is disseminated across the organisation as well, and it's embedded so people understand the process. And then the fourth one, which is quite an important one, was the need to document. So you do this, but it's a case of actually formally documenting the process, and that was actually document the process when you've got a laptop and so forth. How do you wipe it? When do you wipe it? The re-imaging of that, so, and then passing that back onto a different user, but also actually how you dispose of those assets as well in an efficient and effective manner. So that's more about you doing it, but it's more about documenting the process overall. So again, what I would say is those are 4 relatively quick wins, easy to achieve. Management's accepted those, as you see, with regards to the implementation date, with most of them September, but then the last one in March as well. So overall, a strong positive result, but I will pause for any specific questions.
Thanks for that report. Just one for me. On the point about retrieval of assets from levers, I assume since this is an exceptional report, one, that you're happy that we block access to levers in a timely fashion. And secondly, I don't want to mark your homework, but I'm just a bit surprised that wasn't a medium priority risk rather than a low one. What was the thinking behind it being low rather than medium?
I think you may have answered your own question on that one. It was because all the systems are blocked as a lever is encountered, so as soon as they have left, the system is pretty much rendered useless. So that's why we had it as a low priority.
So you're happy that the risk of losing laptops and things is not high enough to justify medium then?
It's not an ideal process, but there was no risk of actually getting into the data or using the data for any malicious need to do that. You are losing obviously an asset. There's a cost associated with that as well, but that's the reason why we did have it as a low rather than a medium. If you hadn't been putting the controls and we'd identified that systems hadn't been disabled in a timely and prompt manner, that would have probably actually been a high rather than a medium priority.
I think the way this has been framed, we have custom and practice around how we deal with assets that we've not retrieved. So Nick, our Assistant Director Digital, will get in touch with the legal team. Legal team will follow up with the individual. What we can't do is make sure that the assets are always on premise, because inevitably we have people working from home, and those people may simply not come back to work, at which point we're always in a sort of retrieval basis. The comfort that I've always gained in this space is Nick's team can just wipe the asset completely remotely, so at that point it's just a dead bit of kit. Now, it's a bit of kit that we desperately like to get back, but I think what the audit report is recommending, which is fair cut, is that we need to formally document the process between digital and legal about the steps that we go through and how we escalate.
Can I just give some assurance on that as well, that this is only one instant that this has happened? So this was somebody that was away from South Yorkshire that we found it difficult to retrieve it back, and they didn't want to have to pay the postage to get it back to us. So we knew where it was, but it was difficult to get it back.
And in those circumstances, it's blocked. Gareth said it's wiped. Does that mean that anybody else to whom the device is passed on to can't access any information from that device?
Yeah, the device is encrypted. It's called BitLocker. That you use to encryption, you'll have to put a PIN number in to get past that encryption. Without that PIN number, it's wiped. You can't get access to it, so nobody could lift the data out of the laptop without that access.
Not even a foreign country.
No, you need that information. Yeah.
As long as it's not Austin, Moscow, you're okay. This gives us a picture of all the assets that exist. Does it give us a picture of the assets as to whether they're being used or not? And I'm thinking about licenses as much as actual pieces of kit here, to make sure that you're aware of what's not being used, and therefore you can cancel the licenses and save money.
Yeah, we know what's currently in use. We've got some software systems in place that are monitoring devices, laptops especially, to make sure they're being in use. And once they're not, then we get them back in as part of our lever process, and then get them wiped appropriately.
Thanks, Jeb. Nick, and Rob, just in terms of the documentation that you're recommending on 168 to document that it's wiped, do we also track in the system who's done it and when? I'm just thinking that you have a full audit trail should an issue occur later on about kit that's getting out there that's we thought was wiped that wasn't wiped.
So whilst we're missing that standard operating procedure which says what we've got to do, we actually do all of those steps, and it's within the system that somebody then goes and they have a check button in our, it's called Hornbill, our system, and they click to say we've done that bit, we've done that bit, we've done that bit, so you've got that audit trail.
Fine, and we can look back to who's done it. Fine, that's great. And just one minor point from me, when we're talking about the kit that we're taking back, phones, I take it they're included as well?
They are included in that, yeah. Anything with data on it's goes through that rigorous process. Obviously a monitor, for example, it doesn't hold data, so we're not that fussed.
Any more? Thank you very much for that report. And moving on, we will shortly be breaking for lunch, but before that we have two restricted items which are not for public or press. So we'll turn off the broadcast before we proceed. Resume this meeting on item 18, Building Simca's Analysis and Insight Capacity and Capability. We have Jenny Holmes. Welcome, Jenny.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. There is a new corporate risk added last time round, which is due to the MCA's capacity and capability in the analysis and insight space. There is a risk that we are unable to gain proportionate and effective strategic insights to inform policy decisions or develop business cases or bids. And what does this mean in effect? That potentially over time and incrementally, we make poorer policy choices and we miss out opportunities for South Yorkshire. So we're developing a plan to address this. So this is a short verbal update today, and my colleague, the new Director of Insight, Kate Miska, will join you in November for a fuller description of the work programme and a fuller paper on the work, the progress that we're making on the work programme. But we'd welcome your steers today on those areas that you'd like a bit more detail on in November. So just to start with a bit of a baseline, we do have analytical capacity and capability within the organisation, and we do have very experienced and qualified colleagues working on data and insight. But not all aspects of the organisation, not all teams can access this expertise, and we probably don't have enough of it even in our core areas. So the challenge that we have going forward is to build out this capacity and then look into the future towards potentially a single settlement for the MCA. We're going to be required to kind of up our game again. We're going to have even more insights into some of the complex policy challenges that we face, stronger cases for investment, and a good evidence base on what works in terms of our interventions and policies. So just a brief update on what we've been doing to date. The first thing that we've done is hired a new Director of Insight on secondment from the Civil Service, and Kate will join you in November. She has 15 years experience in the departments working on public spending and economic policy development. So she's well placed and has good links to the department and all the expertise in the departments as well that we can draw on. And there's a work programme in development which is reducing the residual risk score. This is taking some time because we are engaging and consulting with colleagues across the organisation. One thing that has become obvious is we have expertise across the organisation, people with a wide variety of backgrounds that we could be calling on more as we develop this work programme. There are 3 areas of work already in train. The first is a work programme to develop further our capacity and capability around business cases across the MCA and in our local authority partners, including working with the departments on understanding what they expect and the skills that they can perhaps help us to develop, and have provided more in the annex about that work programme. That's been based on an analysis and appraisal of those bids where we've been more or less successful, and the feedback we've managed to glean from departments or the organisations we've been bidding to about how we might improve next time round. So we're already in phase 1 of that programme of work, which is learning and development training sessions. We held our first one last week with the local authorities. 99 colleagues from across South Yorkshire attended that. We had feedback from that exercise, which was really positive, but did indicate that there's an opportunity to provide more tailored learning experiences for colleagues. There's some people who do this sort of work every day, others that are just starting to learn about business case development. So we need to tailor our approach as we develop the training programme. We're working at the moment on refresher business case training, so the 5-case model, what that means for people's work programmes. And then we'll be looking at more detailed kind of areas of work that colleagues might be interested in, how we make a stronger case around theories of change, but also beyond some of the methodologies that we currently use. So how do we make a more sophisticated place-based argument that would go down well with the departments? We'll then be working with departmental colleagues on round tables, again to share this sort of learning and expertise. And we'll also be looking at sharing model business cases that people could learn from in South Yorkshire. So that's the first area of work. The second area of work is we're scoping out with local authority and wider partners across South Yorkshire how we might further develop our work programme collaboratively and collectively, recognising particularly the resource constraints that we all face, and often that we're collaborating in terms of things like bid development. So how do we develop that network approach? We've recently appointed to a new role, which is the Principal for Analysis and Insight, and that person starts on Monday, and that's a key part of her work programme, taking forward how we work across South Yorkshire to have a networked approach and look at how we might share resources across all of South Yorkshire's organisations. The third area is identifying what South Yorkshire MCA's insight function might need to look like under a single settlement scenario. So as we move to greater devolution, where would we need to increase our capacities and capabilities? Now, we are just starting these discussions with the departments about what that world might look like, but in West Midlands and Greater Manchester, they are already further down the devolution journey. So we've been starting to talk to Greater Manchester in particular about how they organise their insight and analysis functions, and how they've made that scalable as they've gained more devolution powers. So that work is in train to look at how we might learn from others across the MCA family and build our capacity and capability under a more devolved settlement with national government. So those are the kind of main ways that we're addressing the risk currently. As I mentioned, Kate will be coming to give you an update on the next couple of months' work in November, but I'd be grateful for a steer if there are any particular areas of insight where you'd like more detail for next time.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Jenny. I think it's great that the authority's looking at this issue because it seems to me that when you're planning ahead for the future and making big strategic decisions. The trick is to be able to do that with a view as to what the world's going to be like in 2, 3, 5 years' time, as opposed to what it is today. And I think my question to Kate would be, having established a view as to where you think the world's going, how are we going to get that down to departments who are perhaps more dealing with the day-to-day matters and thinking a month, maybe a year ahead, so that when they're thinking about the key issues like we've discussed here, like system replacement, that they're thinking about how will we be doing things in 2 years' time. So I think that, for me, is what we need to, how we need to develop this initiative on getting a capacity to see where we're going, and the insight we're going to get is passing that down through the organisation, so it just becomes a natural thing for people to do when they're thinking about future developments.
Thank you. That's a really helpful steer, and I'll ask Kate to mention some of the work and the conversations we're having with the HR team. So it's very much part of the organisational development conversation, how we become that learning organisation that's continuously improving and understanding what works and the kind of mechanisms for doing that. So thank you.
I think the problem is you don't know what you don't know, to quote somebody. And perhaps almost a sort of wargaming scenario might be useful to discover what we don't know.
I think that's right, and as part of our kind of developing toolkit of methodologies, scenario planning is definitely part of the kind of skill set that we will need to develop. So it is used as part of business case development when you look at your options, but it is something we could use more widely as we try and navigate very complex operating environments. Yeah.
And of course we have 2 very good universities in Sheffield.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd be able to make use of that. I assume we do anyway.
Yeah, that's perhaps something we can sketch out in a bit more detail in November, because we are part of a number of research university kind of networks as well. So that's something that we can kind of shine a light on, so you can get a sense of those networks as well.
Well, we look forward to the report in November, and give us more food for thought. And in the meantime, if we come up with ideas, write them down for November.
Yeah, please do. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the report.
Item 19 is down as update from Joint Independent Audit Committee at South Yorkshire Police. Unfortunately, Steve, the chairman, couldn't stay for the afternoon session, so I had a quick word with him beforehand, and he reminded me that we hadn't had any meetings since the last time he gave the update in July. The only meeting we did have was one that basically was a workshop that basically went through the final accounts. So we did that last week, and I talked through and asked some questions on the final accounts. But other than that, there's nothing to report. So I said, on the basis that I wasn't saying anything, I'd be quite happy to say nothing to the committee.
And I understand there's another meeting of JIAC tomorrow?
There is indeed, yes. The next meeting's tomorrow.
Okay. Does anybody have anything to say about the non-report? No. Okay. We'll learn more in due course. And item 20 is Transport Risk Working Group update.
Thank you, Chair. We did have a meeting of Transport Risk Working Group and welcomed Councillor Livery to the group. We discussed a number of items, in particular the progress that we're making on infrastructure maintenance. The two things which the committee has discussed before have been the repairs to the bridge just outside here on Commercial Street, and that's beginning to start. The work's beginning to start this month. And then the other item was the balance anchor weights for the tram system overhead lines. And I'm pleased to say that there's only going to be about 3 to 4 of those out of the 34 which we previously had to repair that will still need doing. So good progress on that. We also looked at South Yorkshire Future Limited's safety report for the first time, and we had a good read through that, and we've discussed that already in one of the earlier items of this meeting today. We also discussed the item 17 in some detail, the CRM replacement system, and we've covered that again in the closed session. In terms of the risk management report that we looked at, there are a couple of new issues that have been added to the report, which we'll no doubt come on to in the future item for that. One's the security of bus funding, and the second one was the funding of the tram asset renewal. There's been one item that's been downgraded, or the risks reduced. I think it's come down from a 15 to a 12, and that's the application of regional policies, where there's been sufficient progress for officers to decide that the risk there isn't as great as what we've previously seen. And there's also been a couple of risks which have now been closed, one on the ability to think strategically, and the second one on the agility of the organisation to respond to staffing needs, because as we previously discussed here, there is some tightness in the market in terms of getting project management officers, strategy officers. So they've now been rolled up into the general risk item of how does the organisation manage its business in terms of the capacity and skills which the organisation has. So I think those were the main items which we discussed. The only other point I would like to record is our thanks to Tim, and congratulations to him on moving to a new post elsewhere, and thank him very much for all the support which he's given to Transport Risk Working Group. He's got a great knowledge of the detail which we tend to ask questions on, and he's been invaluable to us, certainly over my time that I've been involved with authority in the last 18 months. So thank you, and I wish you on behalf of everybody
Much appreciated.
for the future. Thank you. Happy to take any questions if members of the committee have any.
I know we can endorse that from the committee. Right, can you tell us a bit more about the damage to the bridge, or the need for repair, and the staff system? Does that go all the way down? Is it difficult to recruit from the top to the bottom, or is it just a certain?
Sorry, I haven't. I think that's a red card, because that's the second yellow I've had today. Sorry. So I think on the staffing system, it's particular sort of what I would describe as middle management, senior management, that we've struggled to recruit resources, because there's a general shortage in the area. In terms of the bridge repair outside, there is the view that the problem's been caused by the impact impact of the extreme weather, which we suffered probably a couple of years ago with the extreme heat, and that's what's contributed towards the bearings failure. There'll be other things as well, but that is one of the issues which we need to keep in mind for the future. And we have discussed before about the impact on of climate change on the tram operation in particular, and that's what's caused that one.
And Chair, just a couple of other points on the bridge itself. So as Paul said, the work's due to start in the next week. Scaffolding is going up this weekend into early next week, and physical repairs will be starting the week after that. The actual repair itself is quite normal. It's a encasing of the concrete that surrounds the bearing, some holes being drilled, some additional strengthening on the bearing itself, which will contain the bearing going forward. We've been doing monitoring on the bridge every 3 days, and also there's some remote monitoring infrastructure attached to the bridge at the moment, which gives us detail on how the bridge is responding when heat varies, to Paul's point about thermal expansion. So, you know, we're happy that it's not a risk in terms of its current state and use, but the bearing does need repairing, and that's the purpose of the work that we're about to undertake end of this month, starting into October. So there is a risk on there, as I say. When that work has been completed, we'll review the risk and potentially close it down, although it's part of a general risk around condition of assets and condition of structures, which will remain open, because that clearly won't go away.
So that's fairly routine maintenance issue.
It's non-routine in the sense that we wouldn't want the bearing to fail in the way it's failed. That's not normal. It's probably inherent from some problems with the initial design going back 30 years. But notwithstanding that point, you know, the design solution that we're putting in place will make good those failings and make it sustainable going into the future. But it doesn't remove the need to do the monitoring, the periodic monitoring that takes place across the network. You know, that's not the only bridge that trams goes over. There's many of them, so we need to keep the monitoring processes in place more generally.
I'm sure the travelling public will be pleased to hear that. Thank you. Anything further? No? You done, Paul?
Yes, I am, thank you.
Chair, there's just one other point regarding the A61, which was raised in the last meeting, which you did declare an interest. I don't know if you want us to give you an update on that now. We have a written update which we can share with you. I mean, just very briefly to give you and indeed members assurance. So the nature of the work on the highway was around Old Mill Bridge on the A61 heading out of Barnsley and into Barnsley, kind of roughly north-south. The work, when originally scoped, extended roadworks much further north from the bridge all the way up to Smithies Lane, as I understand it. That work now has been de-scoped, so we've effectively split the scope of the work into two phases, phase 1 and phase 2. So phase 1 is still going ahead as planned, which is the widening of the carriageway around the bridge to alleviate some of the traffic congestion around the bridge and the roundabout itself. That work will continue and will be completed. The work that won't be done in this phase but has still been designed up, so could be done in a future phase, is the further carriageway work heading north on the A61, as I say, as far as Smithies Lane. So the most of the benefits, and the reason why we phased it in the way we have, is most of the benefits are derived from the phase 1 activity around the roundabout and the bridge area itself, not the carriageway further north. But again, we're happy to share a copy of the more detailed report. We can maybe append it to the minutes for people to see if that's of help.
Well, having declared an interest, I'll be pleased to see that report, because different people have different thoughts on the work going north from there, or effectively coming south.
Indeed. I'll share it and we'll have it distributed with the minutes, Chair.
Thank you very much.
I think interestingly, the conclusion was that once the initial works had started, the congestion was not necessarily any worse than what it would have been, if I remember it correctly. But you may have a different view on it, Chair.
Yes, I have observed differently. Okay, we'll say no more on that with the mics on. Okay, thank you very much for that, Paul and Tim. And No further questions. We'll move on to item 21, risk monitoring report, which is Claire.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. So on this report, just a few things to note. On the cover paper, section 2.1, just highlighting the progress that we've made in implementing the internal audit actions that we had at the end of last calendar year. And then on the appendix on the actual dashboard, at corporate level, just to note that there's a new corporate level risk that we've added around housing and strategic planning readiness. And then on the risk relating to a fragmented regional approach to achieving net zero, that's reduced in residual score due to realignment of some resources internally, and we're due to bring a more detailed look at that to the next committee meeting, and that's on the work plan. In addition, as Jenny mentioned, the residual score on the insight and capacity and capability is also reduced, but that's not reflected in this report, so we'll make sure that that's noted in the minutes. It is in the heat map. It should show us the residual score, and it's gone from a 16 to a 12, I think, this time, or 15. So that has reduced as well due to the work underway that Jenny's described in the earlier item. And then the risk around BSIP and Enhanced Partnership Scheme delivery has increased in score, I think, due to the uncertainty around funding continuation from March 2025. So I just also wanted to mention that there are a number of corporate risks where we haven't actually increased the residual score, but just want to highlight that there is a dependency on the outcome of the spending review in the autumn budget, and perhaps Gareth might be able to give a little bit more information about that. So on the heat map page within the dashboard report, there's a matrix number on each of the risks, and I think it would be number 4, 6, 7, 9, 11 and 17. Probably all have some kind of dependency on spending review, but I'll let Gareth maybe give a little bit more information about that.
Thank you, Claire. So the MCA has a number of funding cliff edges as we approach the new financial year. I think probably fair to say we had reasonable degree of confidence about the continuation of those funding streams before the election, and certainly before the Chancellor announced £22 billion worth of deficit within the current year budget. So these funding streams are largely central to what we are doing, so I'll quickly zip through them. So we have bus funding that is currently sustaining the level of network that we're operating to at the moment. We need roughly around £11 million to sustain the network next year. If we don't get that, you'd be looking at a network reduction that take us to around 40% of what we were pre-pandemic, and could potentially impact the weekend and evening services that we're currently buying back at the moment. So there's lots of subsidy going into the network. It's coming largely from government funding, but also local MCA funding. We can't shoulder all that burden on our own. We do need a continuation of national support. So that has been part of our submission into government. Obviously, the Secretary of State for Transport is the Sheffield MP. She's been into this building and talked to us about this issue, which has been very helpful for us to articulate our issues in a way that would be understood with the local context. The second point that's really important to us is the continuation of UK Share Prosperity Fund. So members probably recall that South Yorkshire was a significant beneficiary of European monies through Objective 1 and Objective 2, and things like ESF and ERDF contributed lots of money to this region. That ended with the UK's exit from the European Union, and it was replaced in part by what government called the UK Share Prosperity Fund. Now, UK SPF, which is the acronym, came in at roughly 50% of the monies that we used to get from Europe, so there was already a big hit. However, we've used that money well. We're one of the best performing regions within the country for spending that funding. We've used it for business support, so paying for business advisors, paying for productivity grants and the like, supporting businesses to grow within this region. We've used it to infill around our skills programme, so the majority of our skills funding, including the ASF that we had a report on today, is for post-19 provision. So we've used this money for for bits that ASF can't support. And we also use it for really important schemes around community cohesion and investment into the social fabric of our communities, which, as we've seen over the last few weeks, is a really important issue at the moment. So we're really concerned that government may withdraw that funding. It's due to end in March of this year, and if we do, we'll lose lots of really important social programmes, and it'll also impact our local authority colleagues who often employ entire teams from this funding. So we're asking for a continuation of that and for the promises of the previous government to be fulfilled. We're asking for a continuation of the investment zone funding. So you might recall South Yorkshire was the UK's first investment zone. We're really proud of that. I think it was a great measure of how far this region has come in terms of its business growth aspirations. Current government seems less keen on UK and investment zones. So we are one of only 2 authorities across the country to receive the first year funding allocation for the 10-year IZ settlement that we signed up to. So it's just us and Liverpool who got the year 1 funding. So that's great. We're at the top of the queue. We've done all the homework we were asked to from government, but 1 year of funding doesn't get us very far at all. So we're asking for that funding to be continued. If government wish to change course and call it something different, package it up different, we're willing to work with them in that space, but we desperately need that money and the tools that came with it. We're asking for a continuation around our brownfield housing funding. Again, that money is due to end in March. It arrived in 2021. We were right in the middle of the pandemic. We didn't have a housing pipeline, so it took us a while to get going, but now we're doing really well. And we're well on course to exceed our targets that were set by government for housing starts on brownfield land within this region. So we've currently got 53 million. We could spend well over and above that. And actually, we'd quite like to keep going with the work that we're doing. But we can't do that without continuation of funding. So we're asking for that to be sustained. We're also asking for a continuation of capacity and capability monies for this authority. So we just heard today about the shortfalls in some of our analytic and insight support. We're not really funded for any of that activity. And it would be great if we could get some broader capacity funding from government. This is an ask that other MCAs are also putting forward, and it would compensate for the lack of a business rate retention pilot that lots of our MCA colleagues have, but we don't. So it would be an equalisation of the playing field for us. So we're not asking for anything more. We just want the same sort of deal that others get. And finally, we're asking for a sustained funding settlement for our local authority colleagues. So we recognise that lots of the work that this authority does is through the individual local authorities within South Yorkshire. And if those local authorities are continuously struggling to balance their budgets, they'll not be able to play the full role that we'd like them to do. So we're asking government to address some of those underlying issues that have plagued local authority budgets for a number of years now. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Gareth, helpful summary on the bus position. In terms of the revenue support for the trams, not the capital renewal, which we've discussed already, but in terms of revenues support for the trams, do we see any risks there for future funding?
So we received no government funding at all for the tram revenue. So we're asking government for capital funding for the renewal programme, and indeed that's a key part of our ask around commitment to the CRSTS2 allocation that was announced after the shelving of High Speed 2. But we get no money at all from government for operational running of the tram.
Thank you.
That was some list. So my question basically is, when do you expect to hear the outcome? I'm assuming it won't be in one lot, but it'll probably be rolled over in terms of what you're asking for and programme starts, etc.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I'd watch this space this week for what comes out of Labour Party conference. I suspect there might be a few clues come out there, but the autumn budget will be published on the 30th of October, so we'll know by then. I suspect we'll start to get a nod and a wink from government about what's continuing and what's not. But I think you're right in that this will be a 1-year settlement, which is helpful, but only just kicks the can down the road. So we'll probably have a much better fix on where we are by the time of the spring spending review, which is probably April, May next year. Now that presents problems in terms of our longer term planning. Short-term funding cycles are inefficient. We make short-term decisions. There's largely little benefit to be had from those, and it certainly becomes a problem in terms of capital investment that straddles multiple financial years. So this isn't where we'd like to be, but we can reflect that's the national fiscal position, and that's the way government are intending to do business. So we'll know more at the end of October in the autumn budget, but probably only for 1 year or so, and then I'll start worrying again about what happens the following year, and then we'll know more, definitely know more by the time we get to the multi-year spending review in spring next year.
Yeah, that's very helpful. But the next one is in terms of risk management. I know we can't look into the future, and like yourself, I detest this short-termism in terms of funding. Coming from Doncaster, all the authorities are in exactly the same boat, and it doesn't help. So what sort of managing the risk? That's the point I'm trying to get at. Is if it doesn't come off, I mean, we don't know what the future is, even though it's only a few weeks away.
So I guess on a very practical level, we're avoiding multi-year spending commitments. So we're just taking avoiding action. Now that in itself it ends up being inefficient. So we write break clauses into contracts and the like that suppliers then price accordingly for that risk that they bear. We're using reserves to underpin quite a bit of activity. So you'll imagine that we've got quite a lot of people whose presence within this authority is attached to funding that we're not sure if it continues. So we're underwriting quite a bit of risk for our reserve strategy. And unfortunately, we've been doing this for so long now that we've got used to doing business this way. So it's part of my underlying reserve strategy that we are doing that. Where we've got a real problem, though, that is simply just very hard to manage is around the bus funding, because we have a very short window, as Tim will be able to tell you, about reacting to changes in the bus network, and there will come a point in the next few months that if we don't get clarity over that bus funding, services will start to be withdrawn in advance of the new year, and our ability to manage that is really curtailed because we simply don't have the quantum of funding locally to backfill that. So, Tim, do you want to just...
Yeah, just a couple of other points on that. It's much easier to manage the risks that we have almost total control over, but from a bus perspective, from a commercial bus network perspective in particular, an operator can give us 42 days notice and then pull a service in its entirety. So we can only respond to those events when they occur. We can try and provide a level of stability and certainty to the operators through our contracting regime, and that certainly gets us to a point in time. But to Gareth's point, beyond the level of certainty of the end of March, we can afford about 50% of the levels of funding that we've committed thus far. All of our contracting runs out then, so we've only committed to contracts as far as we know that we have funding certainty. But certainly from a position perspective, that gives us cause for concern. Now, what we might have to do is to provide some bridging to allow for to a smoothing of the transition away from the current network, were that to be required. We've done that in the past, and we've taken steps down in the network to try and smooth the funding instead of having peaks and troughs in resource and therefore network, because that does nothing for passenger confidence in the system. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge that we've been through on many occasions through COVID, and we've managed to largely protect the network and certainly do it in a sustainable way, certainly only as far as the funding allows at this point in time. But I'm as keen as everyone around this table to see what's said on the 30th of October and see where that takes us, certainly for the next 12 months. I think final point on that's really important relative to where we take ourselves on a bus reform decision. So, talked a little bit earlier about the opportunity that presents, but funding certainty and network stability through that process is also really important.
Councillor Livery.
Thanks, Chair. Brownfield housing funding is a real concern for us in Sheffield, because our local plan, which is in the final stages of assessment through government inspectors, will be done this year, and it predicates the vast majority of the plan on regeneration of the brownfield in Sheffield. And quite clearly, developers would have a preference to build in the green belt, and if we don't get the brownfield assistance, we're going to be under pressure not to regenerate the city, which is not a place to be. And we really need to try and secure long term the brownfield funding, because it's vital that we do get the city regenerated in the way we want to. Thank you.
Yeah, I imagine to some extent that's on Sheffield to get its development plan passed. So developers have to fit into that.
There is pressure to put greenfield in.
Thank you. Just thinking about the pressures we might face on reorganising the bus routes. You mentioned, Tim, that I think there's a 6-week notice period for an operator to withdraw from a tendered service contract. And we're not making a commitment beyond the end of March 2025. What's the workload going to look like then for the transport team if we do get some direction and we do need to go back out and engage more operators for whatever period of time? Have we got the capacity to be able to respond to that?
So the 42 days is for commercial service withdrawal, not for tendered service withdrawal, although it works in both directions. In terms of the workload, it's not proportionate to the size of the change necessarily. The more you do, the actually proportionally less resource you need, because there are economies of scale in just actually having to do the work even on a relatively small number of contract changes. We've done this before, so when we did the short-term changes in November 22 and November 23, we were covering somewhere in the region of about 800-900 live contracts at that point in time. We're down to about 300 now, so we've consolidated our contract base accordingly. You have to build in the necessary time to do the work. The time-consuming part actually isn't the predictable element, which is the registration, processing of information, publication, timetable change implementation date. It's the public negotiation, consultation, political engagement in the run-up to that process that takes time. If it were a change of such significance that, let's say we got no funding whatsoever through government and we had to step the network down by roughly 50% in terms of funding investment, then inevitably we would strongly recommend a public consultation on what that looked like. At 12 weeks, we wouldn't find out, what that probably in terms of output until probably April or May, which means we probably couldn't make a network change until perhaps September of next year. So that's the kind of time frame that we're working to. I am optimistic in the sense that we won't get to that point, because I think we'll get a continuation of funding and just need to build in inflationary cost pressures into our budget for the next year and deal with it in that regard. But we have a sense of priority already, because that's what we implemented back in in October of last year, to prioritise schools, work, healthcare over evenings, weekends and Sundays. That's why we've got the risk as it stands at the moment in terms of those kinds of services.
Thank you.
If we were into bus franchising already, would the situation be improved? Would it be better?
So I think yes, in a way. So I guess 2 principal points, and jump into them if I miss anything. So under franchising, we will be in control of the route. So we would not have a sort of impending sort of Damocles moment where we were waiting for operators to respond. That very much would be within our gift. So we don't have to plan and prepare for a change that is out of our control. It would just be part of the overall planning cycle that we would manage generally. The funding point is an interesting one. So we have prepared the franchise assessment on the basis that there is no support from government at all. And the franchise assessment says that in the long run, you can maintain the network that we have today. And the reason that you can do that is, one, we be more efficient in how we use services, but the second is that we put capital investment into the running of the bus services. So we use our capital funding from our City Region Sustainable Grant Settlement and to invest in fleet renewal, to buy depots, to maintain depots and so on. And what that does means that you need less revenue subsidy going in, because essentially you're putting capital subsidy in, so you switch in to a more efficient funding regime. So into the future, we will be less exposed to the vagaries of government funding cycles than we are today. So that's another sort of benefit of the overall control.
I think just very, very briefly, Chair, two of the points that are worth noting. The network as it is at the moment contains competition, particularly in Sheffield, but not exclusively. So, there are certain corridors that are in essence overbussed. There's more resource on them than is necessary based on demand. We would be taking that out. We wouldn't necessarily need that level of demand, level of resource in there, because you've not got two operators competing for the same market. So there's an efficiency to be had in the system in that regard. Of the current network as it stands, we pay, certainly from a mileage perspective, around 25% of that network. But for every mile that we pay, the operators that we pay to run those services have built in a margin of profit to that service delivery. And clearly we wouldn't be doing that on our own service delivery, because we would want to reinvest, the overheads of that or any benefits from those services back into the network more generally. So there's a couple of, key features and key differences in the network over and above, its current configuration. But, Gareth's points are all absolutely correct as well in terms of the wider benefits of how you finance the system more generally.
Just to comment on the tram revenue and no government funding for that, which clearly means that we have to get the footfall up to be able to run the operation effectively and deal with the ageing fleet, because that's more costs. So this is going to be a challenge, I suspect, over the next few years to get the revenue and revenue streams running sufficiently to make sure we can meet our maintenance requirements and the like.
Yeah, absolutely agree. So our bids into government from the City Region Sustainable Transport 1 settlement was for £100 million for urgent renewals work that is required. And our business case that's just approved at OBC by Department for Transport back in March requested a further £500 million for the next stage of investment. So this is fleet that is largely 30 years old, running on rails that are largely 30 years old, and overhead equipment that's 30 years old. It requires replacement. One of the inhibitors on growing patronage is reliability, and that was a significant part of our business case. If you're running an unreliable service, people don't want to use it, they'll find other modes. But equally, we're also looking at about what's next. So my personal view, professional, is that the only way that you grow the tram towards sustainability is you probably push it down different routes to different areas. So one of the things that we were working with government on was restoring your railways bids, which was running the tram on heavy rail, similar to the tram train that runs to Rotherham right now, and that would have enabled us to go to places like Waverley, where there's clearly growing communities with growing demand, and out towards Stocksbridge. Now, the Restoring Your Railway bids our programme has now been withdrawn by government as part of the approach to managing the national deficit. But government have not closed the door completely on that activity. They've just closed that individual programme down. So there is work ongoing around what we call the tram vision. So what's next for tram? how do we get it to a point that it can wash its own face and doesn't require public subsidy via the transport levy.
Just on the tram then, has anybody done any calculations to see how much revenue can get if we use the spare capacity on the trams, to see whether or not it can cover its operating costs?
I'm going to answer the question slightly differently if that's helpful, Paul. We know that the tram can carry and has previously carried upwards of 15.5-16 million passengers.
Right.
We're currently at 9 million.
Yep.
So there's a huge amount of spare capacity there in the system because demand is spiky. You know, there's times of the day when the trams aren't particularly busy. We need to look at ways of smoothing that demand out and making use of the capacity on board. You know, and when it was running 15.5-16 million passengers, it was turning profit. It was a profitable system in its day. So, you know, even without increasing frequency, even without putting extensions in place, we know the system in its current guise can make a profit. But we need to put in place the systems and the kind of the attributes of the wider change. You know, whether that's further growth in the city centre in terms of housing, you know, whether that's planning decisions and so on that allow us to drive that demand. The other thing, just very briefly on potential bus franchising opportunity, is to temper and shape demand. So either put feeder services into tram nodes that then people connect onto, or indeed remove potentially some competing bus services when actually tram is a better alternative. And again, those are not controls or options that we have available to us at the moment. We'll be assessing how that might look under a franchised environment were we to get to that point. But there's definite opportunities of integration as well that can drive those passengers onto the system.
Thank you, that's helpful to know about the capacity. So I suppose then it comes down for the tram about demand, as you say, is it there to be able to be tapped, and how do we get changing modal shift to using the tram?
Yeah, and there are policy choices that ultimately will be at our disposal, I'm sure, to drive some of those behaviours.
Yeah. The bit about the business case that the Department for Transport really liked is that for one of the first times we've been able to present a sort of compelling strategic narrative about how the entire system is pointing in now towards tram, and that's largely based on things like the city centre neighbourhood framework that Sheffield have just delivered, which is building 30,000 homes within the inner ring road, building entire new communities at Attercliffe, which is a brownfield housing scheme, and down at Neeps End and Shalesmore, which brownfield housing scheme. So you got a local authority that's bending toward communities towards the tram. We've got MHCLG providing funding for new communities. We're using brownfield housing monies and our transport monies, and it all works towards what we sort of loosely call urban densification. So if you want to run a good transport system, you need really strong urban centres, because the hub and spoke model for public transport means most services running in and out of town centres, city centres. So you need lots of people either living or working within those areas. Now, we know retail patterns have changed. We know office accommodation requirements have changed post-pandemic. So if you've lost people coming into the city centre, town centre for shopping purposes, and if people aren't working there as often as they used to, how do you increase the footfall? And the answer is that people live there. Mm-hmm. So you only need to look up the road and see the number of high-rise buildings going up to see that that's what we're kind of aiming for. And it was incredibly helpful for the business case that we put into government, that we were able to say that the entire system is working towards tram now, rather than over the last 10-20 years, tram has been a bit out there, someone else's problem. It's Stagecoach's concession. We're now saying we're all pointing in the same direction, trying to drive up patronage. So it was incredibly helpful.
And the 500 million capital that you talked about, or the 500 million pound additional above the 100 million asset renewal, is that 500 million, if I remember correctly, for the replacement of the existing fleet? It's not for new lines, is it?
Yeah, it's the same footprint, but new vehicles, all sorts of new things like substations, overhead power capacity lines, the like. So as I mentioned, the tram infrastructure was put in 30 years ago. The most we've done over the last few years is some rail replacement on the life expired rails. The entire thing is now ready for renewal, so the depot needs upgrading, the substations need upgrading, the actual vehicles will need upgrading after the temporary works that we do on them now to address things like corrosion. There'll be works on the infrastructure, so we talked about the bridge work that's happening. So this is, significant physical public infrastructure requires ongoing investment into it, and we're now at that point that it needs doing.
But if we have battery operated trams, then some of those problems might go away.
So we are looking at some innovative technology solutions, working with partners at the university in this space. We made some money available to test that. So one of the characteristics of our tram system is that inevitably Sheffield's quite hilly, so there is the opportunity for regenerative, I can never say that word, regenerative braking, coming down places like Park Range Road and the like, and that's really appealing to me as a finance director when energy prices are so high. So whatever we can do to get energy costs down would be really beneficial.
Just briefly, we're also a member of UK Tram, so we can learn from other systems and networks. You may have seen the likes of Birmingham have put in effectively hybrid vehicles that run on overland equipment, but also just off battery power in the city centre. So there's form elsewhere in the country that we can learn from, and we're certainly not at a point yet where we've baked in any decisions around vehicle design, infrastructure design in that regard, and we'll take those decisions as part of the £500 million case that Gareth has been talking about.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're right, Gareth. I mean, there's interdependencies both between the tram and the housing development, which are key. And for the tram to work well, whilst Neepsend and Shalesmoor development's progressing quite quickly, Attercliffe is slow. There's just that one waterside development at the moment, and what we can't afford to do is leave Attercliffe in the state it's in at the moment. It has got to be regenerated, and all these things play together. And when we respond to government, are we pointing out these interdependencies, making sure they're clear on them?
Yeah, I think we're actually slightly ahead of the curve in this respect compared to other areas. So we've been taking a place-based approach to our investment for quite a while now, and that's been place plans that have been prepared in Rotherham, Doncaster and Barnsley. Sheffield are working on theirs. We're expecting it this month, in fact, and that will flow on the back of the city goals work that you'll be familiar with. So when we talk to government, we package up how we talk about this. So we point at all the different government level interventions that are going into a place and saying, it's no point you put in levelling up funding into that area and towns fund and future high street funds and so on if you can't get anyone there. And there's no point us developing out the Advanced Manufacturing Innovation District if you're an apprentice and you can't get there from Barnsley or Doncaster or wherever across the region. So you need composite funding packages to support place-based interventions, and too often we get funding that is very fragmented and compartmentalised, so it becomes very difficult to make it all stitched together to be more than the sum of its parts. So the really encouraging thing is that government is increasingly looking at the world in the way that we are and talking about place-based missions. But they're also really interested in moving towards what in the past we've called single settlement, but the new language from government is an integrated settlement, and that's likely to be the next stage of devolution for this region, which is rather than give us 40 plus funding streams that balance the budget in the current financial year, they'll give us a much more condensed one, and they will say, this is your money to deliver an agreed set of outcomes. Now go away and determine what's best for South Yorkshire within that. And that will allow us to take a more place-based approach where we tackle certain areas, and we might just not spread the jam incredibly thinly across the entire region. We might say, okay, we need to do something about Attercliffe or Edlington or any of the other areas that really matter to us. And then we work out how best to spend the money in that context. And that would mean we've got much more discretion to work out what's right for us. So that's the next stage. There's an awful lot of work to be done before we get there, and you can imagine that is a fundamentally different way of looking at the world in Whitehall than they're currently used to, where they are very much departmental siloed. So there's a lot of work for government to do about making sure that Whitehall can support that. But I think that's the future, and that's the way we address some of these knotty issues.
As someone representing Barnsley, perhaps Doncaster feels the same. I always feel a bit left out when we're talking about trams.
Sorry, you picked up a point I was going to say, which is the losing of the ability to run the tram on the heavy train network runs the danger of disenfranchising bits of the region that we were really keen to try and enfranchise by getting the tram further. So that's a real shame. Just a couple of other thoughts from me since we're on this topic. City centre living does feel a bit like it's going to mean there's going to be less need for people to use public transport because they're going to walk or cycle. On the other hand, if people are only travelling into work 2 days a week in the city centre, given the fixed costs of running a car, that might make travelling on public transport actually more attractive. And then just a sort of semi-personal lobbying point, post-Grenfell, it's actually quite hard to get mortgages on buildings particularly more than 5 stories high. I had a son who tried to get one in Leeds and basically couldn't get a mortgage because the building was more than 5 stories high because the lenders just wouldn't lend on it. So I don't know whether anyone's really picked that up in central government, but all the post-Grenfell stuff has just made the insurance costs on high-rise buildings so much that mortgage lenders they literally refuse to lend to even after they said they would do. At the last minute they pulled the mortgage offer on the basis the building was more than 5 stories high. Even then it was. Sorry, personal point, but that might be an issue we need to think through the consequences of.
You might be frightened, can't you?
Yeah, so.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a good or bad thing that Barnes doesn't have a tram currently, because we've got a wonderful town centre that people would rather go to than Meadowhall. So, apparently. Okay. If we finish on that, I've lost my thing. If we finish on that, we are on to item 22, Governance Improvement Plan. Claire.
Thank you, Chair. This is just the usual update that we bring forward to the committee. Happy to answer any questions or field some feedback if I'm not able to answer on any particular points.
Paul.
You go.
Just as you're obviously closer to this than perhaps we are there any items on here that you feel are perhaps more difficult to deliver than others, or is it all going ahead to plan?
As far as I'm aware, things are on track. That's certainly the ones that kind of come under my purview I feel quite confident about. There are a couple on there around monitoring of tendered services, which relates back to an internal audit previously that we've had. There's an item on there that relates to the previous item that Jenny presented, connects to that. And then the one on the consultation engagement framework, I don't know whether Tim might want to add some context on that one or some further details.
Well, I would say on that, there's a couple of dimensions to that piece of work. There's one which is a general approach and principle for the MCA in terms of how it looks to engage with the public on any matter, and how we make sure that we've got adequate reach in doing so. I think more obvious in terms of the immediate ask will be around our bus franchising consultation, should the decision be taken to move to public consultation on that, and again for that same reason, making sure that we design our approach such that we get adequate engagement and appropriate engagement across all communities to comment on our plans for bus reform. So there's a couple of dimensions to it, I guess, but one more immediate than the other.
And I ask that question because I don't know whether you've just filtered out all the amber ones for us, but they're all amber, as they say. Oh, I was going to say, as they say, other colours are available.
Yes, they are.
So none are assessed as red, but
No.
equally none are assessed as. Do we have a yellow and a green, or in this?
I've just gone with the red, amber, green for the reg
okay, so
rating.
these are all-
The second one down, I think that's the one that's on the cusp
Okay.
and needs to be implemented. Should be implemented very soon. Otherwise, that might go to red. But yeah, at the moment, it indicates that they're all in progress but not quite due.
Fine.
So you should get some different colours next time, Paul.
Thank you.
If I just add a little to this, there's a number on here that are tied up with what we call our harmonisation process, and this is how we ensure that people across the organisation following the integration of the passenger transport exec into the MCA are paid in a equal, fair and consistent manner. So adoption of the VIP principles and the rollout of that into the future, and the policies and procedures are all tied up into a single agreement that we'll make with the unions. We're a bit behind schedule on that for a number of good reasons, not least the OPCC integration came along right in the midst of this, as did the election, and then we've just appointed a new HR director who has come in with a lot of good ideas about how we should do this with a slightly different view of the world than previous interim that we had in role. So we're taking a little bit more time on that, and we should get that agreed hopefully by next time we see in November. So a number of those should get boxed off at the same time.
And in November, we will be able better to progress item 4 on your list, I think.
My question was going to be the same as Paul's. I was a bit surprised they were all ambers, but you've explained why. The one where we're at 97%, we've only got one team to go yet on information asset registers. I think you might have been a bit harsh on yourself. That feels quite green. But anyway, but they'll change over time.
Yeah, so this is presents the regular work plan to just check in with members if there are any additional items that need to be added in there. I've noted already in the progress of the meeting about bringing back updates on the CRM progress and potentially some training on the Economic Crime Act alongside the other training that we're looking at as well. So if there's anything else, please let me know.
So just one question from me. The risk management training, is that also on the horizon? Because we talked about that before.
I was copied into an email exchange between Mike, who was taking it forward, and the potential provider, I think on the 19th. So there is some progress there, but I don't think we've finalised any kind of date around that yet. So, but it is in progress.
Thanks very much.
Moving on, Gareth.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Committee will recall that we always have a standing item on the agenda which is around breaches of the contract procedure rules and any suspected instances of fraud. Ordinarily, I just take this as verbal and say nothing to report. But this time I've got a matter to bring to your attention associated with some commissioning of activity within the Police and Reform Directorate. It's an interesting one in that ultimately there wasn't a technical breach of the contracts and procedure rules, but that was only due to good work from within some of our corporate teams and a little bit of fortune in that we found a route to bring the procurement back in line with the contract standards. So This was an issue where we identified that a senior officer had approached a supplier to deliver a piece of work that was required and budgeted for at around £70,000. We got wind of it quite late in the day, just before the work had formally started. But due to the nature of the work and the timeliness that was required, and we felt that we didn't have much choice other than to proceed with the current supplier that had been identified, teams then found a public sector framework in which to engage them in a compliant manner so we could pull it back into compliance. However, it was clearly not the way that we wish to do business. So teams have been spoken to. I've had words with the individual involved, and we've wrapped processes around this to make sure it doesn't happen again. My diagnosis was that this largely relates to the fact that we're operating new procedures now within the Police and Reform Directorate. They had a way of doing business previously before they transferred into the MCA, and there was a bit of sloppy shoulders about who was responsible for undertaking things like the procurement process associated with this engagement. So we've closed the gaps now, and you'll note that we've got the internal audit that's planned to take place quite soon, to just test some of this sort of activity going forward. So I'm reasonably hopeful that this won't happen again. So it's just to bring it to your attention.
Yes, Paul. So, point of clarification, Gareth, from what you're saying, this is an activity that was undertaken by South Yorkshire Police. It was undertaken by what would formerly have been the OPCC. Right, thank you.
Yes. And I hear that you've done some initial work with officers, making sure they understand what they should have done. Is that going to be followed up by ongoing reminders and training as they turn over, and otherwise in 6 months' time they'll have forgotten about it and be doing the same thing again?
Yeah, so what we do in the rest of the business is that the finance business partners, as part of their monthly sessions, run through the procurement pipeline with budget holders, and we use that information to then pass back to the procurement teams, and it means we've got a continuous circle of information flowing between budget holders as the commissioners of activity, the finance team, and back to the procurement team, and that largely means that we're always on top of information. And clearly things arise in the near term. That wasn't quite happening early doors with the new teams, not least because they had their own finance team that transferred over, and I think there's a slight different culture in the way that business was being done. So we've closed that loop now, and we're adopting the processes that I've just described. And for now, in the interim, I'm sitting in on those meetings with senior officers as well, just so I can make sure that it gets off to the right start and we embed the right behaviours early doors.
Is there some sort of contract register that flags up the big contracts that's coming up in the pipeline?
Yeah, this was an entirely new commission, so it wasn't like a cyclical repeating one.
Sorry, just following that up. So, because presumably, for someone who's new into the organisation, they would just issue a work instruction without thinking of doing a purchase order. Presumably, it would have been like a almost verbal letter or written letter of engagement that was taken, as opposed to going through. So, is there something we need to learn from that? In terms of had they been inducted into the way the authority works prior to doing this?
Yeah, people should have known better, frankly, yeah.
I should have been noticed here saying press the button. Okay, nothing further on that item. We move to item 25, final item, and it's issues for escalation. None have been notified to me already. No. Okay, thank you very much. That brings me to the end of my agenda. Thank you very much for attending.